It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event about the Nigerian elections and the future of Nigeria, which we are hosting here at the Open Society Foundations. The Open Society Foundations is the world's largest private funder of independent groups working for justice, democracy, and social cohesion. Here in Europe, we work a lot on strengthening democracy, social cohesion, migration, and other human rights issues, as well as trying to advocate for Europe to play a stronger role in advancing global justice, sustainability, and democracy worldwide. In fact, Open Society started off as a foundation in Africa in 1979. Looking across the room, I think I'm probably one of the few who remembers actively the year of 1979. So we have been around for quite a while. And I think we see it as our role as a global organization who's trying to connect regions, but is based and rooted in the different regions, to bring more understanding, build bridges between the different regions of the world, and here particularly between Africa and Europe. And for us in Europe, I think it's becoming increasingly clear, particularly in the political circles, Africa matters. If you look at the recent almost frenzy of visits by heads of state and foreign ministers and others to Africa, it's clearly seen a renewed interest in Africa, which is long overdue. And I would argue that among the many African countries, Nigeria is of particular importance. It's the continent's most populous country, the largest economy, and home to a very vibrant civil society, particularly driven by the youth. But also, as we'll hear later, it plays an outsized role in the region itself in terms of security and stability. So where is Nigeria at in 2023? I think this is what our panel will discuss. There has been a recent election, however marked by low turnout, questions of legitimacy and transparency raised by many independent groups, many of them OSF has been supporting. However, these elections, at least in the media I've been following, have not gotten much attention. They should have been worldwide news. They haven't been, and we want to use this opportunity here to shed more light on these elections and their consequences for the country and the region. And we would like to do this together with our colleagues from the Africa Policy Research Institute, APRI, who have helped to co-organize this event. APRI is an African think tank with a strong presence here in Germany, in Berlin. It researches key policy issues facing the continent and tries to bring those issues closer to German and EU policy circles. APRI has published a series of reports on the elections, which I would encourage you to have a look at. So before I hand over to the moderator, I would like to recognize the presence of His Excellency Ambassador Yusuf Maitama Tugar, Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Nigeria in Germany, as well as Mr. Alexandre Caligaro, Deputy Head of the Division for West and Central Africa in the German Federal Foreign Office. We are very grateful for your attendance, and we look forward to engaging with you today, but hopefully also at future occasions. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to our moderator, Tomi Oladipo. Tomi built a strong reputation on insightful reporting and analysis on issues related to African policies and politics, first with the BBC and now with Deutsche Welle. And he will guide us through this event. Tony, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for being here and for everyone joining us as well on the stream. It's a pleasure to have this event and have you as part of our audience. Now, Nigeria is the focus of this. Anyone who knows Nigeria knows just how complex this country is. We know a lot about Nigeria that we can talk about. For example, Africa's largest country, Africa's most populous country. But the complications begin there. Africa's most populous country. What is the population of Nigeria? Anyone who tells you they know what Nigeria's population is lying to you, because nobody actually knows. There are questions over our last census, 2006, I believe it was, and we're supposed to have another one soon, and we only just guesstimate that it's 200 and what's the last? So I mean, that tells you a lot about this country, not just from the complication with our numbers, but who we are. We're just talking earlier about even the makeup of this country and the questions about whether the country should even exist. But the country does exist. It is, as someone reminded us, good people, great nation was the slogan we had some years back. And Nigeria has just come off the back of elections, very highly anticipated elections, where we saw the nexus between the old guard and, well, it was essentially the old guard overall, but one movement powered by youth. And now it was a vibrant election. There were questions about the process, but we've got to this point where we do have a winner who will be sworn in at the end of May, the incoming president, Bola Ahmed Tinubu. So we'll be discussing some of these issues as well as Nigeria going forward. Where does all of this leave Nigeria? And to do that, we have a distinguished panel here. I will start just actually from the far, usually ladies first, but gentlemen just before. So Chetan Mwanze is, I've known Cheta for a long time. He's a versatile professional, vast background. He has more than 15 years of work experience across Nigeria, the UK, and the US in security, in IT risk, cybersecurity, and advisory. He's a lead partner at SBM Intelligence, which is a Nigerian-based geopolitical risk advisory firm, and providing intelligence and solutions to issues relating to Nigeria. So, Cheta, it's good to have you on the panel. And right next to him, we have Dr. Habiba Ahud Dagash. We are glad to have you here, Senior Associate with the Africa Energy Program at the Rocky Mountain Institute. She has a PhD in Energy Systems from Imperial College in London, holds bachelor's and master's degrees in Engineering Science from Oxford, published countless journal articles on low-carbon energy transition. So we'll have a climate discussion rather, and she will spearhead that. Yemi Adamalekum is to my immediate left, Executive Director of Enough is Enough Nigeria, which is a network, a non-partisan individuals and organizations pushing for good governance in Nigeria and public accountability. Yemi has a long, diverse career, mathematics, economics, and now you development studies and an MBA at Oxford's Saïd Business School. And now we find yourself in advocacy for your great nation. So I'll start with you, Yemi, on that note. We just talked about the elections and the drama behind it, the build-up to it, the results, and where we find ourselves. What are your reflections on the elections? We'll just go through that briefly.
Sure, thank you. And thank you to Afripoli and OSF for the invitation. I mean, as you said, there's been a lot of drama, so I think I'll save us rehashing some of that and talk a bit about the positives, I would say, in that election on election, we continue to see improvements, because in as much as the election management body and Nigerian citizens become more aware, it forces our politicians are quite interested in literally winning at all costs. And I think, if nothing else, what that has done is it's forced us to keep thinking about how to innovate the process. So elections in Nigeria are not just about you wake up, you go and vote, and it's that simple. It's how do you ensure that people's votes count? And how do you ensure that human beings are the ones voting and not ghosts, so to speak? So I think in the use of technology, even though there was a big backlash from the failure of it, a good part about it is that for the accreditation process, where you just ensure that it's the right number of people that actually get to vote, that actually worked. And the data does back that up, the BVAS and the accreditation process, and that's certainly a positive. And really, even though the IREF portal failed for the presidential election and people were not able to see in real time, the fact that the innovation is there, and we've seen, I think, Premium Times, for example, did this a couple of weeks ago, that showed that in one particular state, the IREF showed that Peter Obi won as opposed to Bola Tinubu. The BBC just released the same story today, and everybody's now talking about it. But a Nigerian platform had done that 3 weeks ago. But I say that to say that that's a good bit about that in terms of technology. And the second part I'd like to highlight is just more awareness. Enough is Enough Nigeria has played in the election space since 2011. That was the first election. This is now our fourth. And election on election, we've seen more and more Nigerians get more aware of the power that the ballot provides. Nigeria is a democracy, but in none of our formal institutions is democratic practice taught. It's not taught in school. You just kind of figure it out as you go along. And I think we've seen that increase awareness. Social media has played a huge role in that, and I think that's something to be celebrated.
Okay. Maybe I'll come to you. What are your takeaways? Were you in the country during the elections?
Yes, I was.
What did you observe, and what are you taking with you from that?
Maybe I'll focus on the negatives since you spoke about the positives. So in the lead up to the elections, I felt like the rhetoric, whether online or in person, was particularly divisive. I think the amount of candidates and voters that relied on identity-based slogans to try and shore up their base to ensure that their candidate won or their party won was surprising. Of course, we've had 8 years of maybe heating up of ethnic, religious kind of tensions in the country, but really seeing that even in personal interactions, I thought was quite shocking. And the other negative side of it was because we were so focused on identity-based politics, there was actually a lot of limited scope for debate about issues. The thing is, it's not that there's straightforward solutions to Nigeria's challenges, whether that's climate change or the energy transition or the economy, but we couldn't even present different points of view and debate that on a level playing field because we were so concerned that somebody had said something about someone's tribe. And someone likes me, someone doesn't like me. So I thought that was really disappointing because from my perspective as an academic or working in the energy space, we actually don't have any ideas. We're trying to fix some of the utilities in the country who are facing a liquidity crisis. Okay, if you increase the tariff, but then the inflation. So we're kind of going in circles trying to figure out what is the model to save the sector, a sector that is the foundation of economic development. But there just wasn't any conversation on that. And another thing I thought was really disappointing is we couldn't also use that kind of commentary to influence the candidates about the type of people in their cabinets. Who is best placed to resolve the problem with the distribution companies in Nigeria? Who is going to understand that climate change needs to be central in the future development strategy of the country? We haven't had that debate, and now that people are sort of jostling for positions, we don't know if this is central to the candidate of President Tinubu. We have really no idea, and we have failed to pressure, I guess, use the run-up to the elections to be able to influence some of that decision-making, which is a real disappointment. But just to agree, I think the promise of youth engagement, I was blown away. I actually didn't think Nigerian youth can be fickle at times. And I was really, really impressed, and it inspired me to want to actually engage with the democratic process, which I will admit I just do not have a lot of faith in. But yeah, I think I'll leave my comments there.
Cesar?
The elections there were goods, there were bads, there were uglies, but I think what I would want to dwell on is missed opportunity. We missed an opportunity, in my view, to strengthen the faith of a coming generation of Nigerians in the democratic process. This election period, the election campaign, saw the largest, for a while at least, enthusiasm, a lot of enthusiasm by young people, many of whom, unlike my generation, EMA's generation, had seen the tail end of military rule and could easily be intimidated, easily be disenchanted. Now, because of the manner in which the election happened, the questions that are unanswered, many of them may probably disengage. We've seen, as a result of it, more people making inquiries about moving out of the country. That, in my view, is a missed opportunity because Many of these people have skills that will be useful in rebuilding what has become a derelict country. However, even in that missed opportunity, there are still opportunities. Opportunities if the legal system can at least restore some faith. I think that concentrating on what candidate or which candidate is declared winner, or whether the legal system decides to maintain status quo or declare another election or declare another candidate winner, is irrelevant. It's the process, how it happens. And I think that was the key thing that was missed, especially during the presidential election. That process is very important. Most people that I know, at least, are rational enough to say that if we had an election and somebody is announced as the winner and everybody can see it very clearly that there was no, to quote a Nigerian politician, there was no higgy haga, then we would have a situation where everybody would be very willing to join hands to rescue a ship that is basically adrift. And that is the most fundamental problem with Nigeria and, unfortunately, with the continent, which could affect Europe. Nigeria is, by virtue of geography, in a position where a collapse would affect everyone. It's not just the fact that we have probably 213 million people. It's our location. Right now, Sudan has gone to pieces. If you look at a map, the sliver of land that separates Nigeria from Sudan, it's not that much. And there are a lot of people in Sudan who trace their ancestry to Nigeria. If they decide to migrate back home, as it were, being Africans, we know what home means. If they decide to migrate back home, and then they come back home to a country that is teetering on the edge because the incoming administration is suffering from a crisis of legitimacy, then what happens next? And that is a question that we all have to ask. What happens next?
I'm going to cut you short just there. We'll come back to those issues in a bit. I want to just go to each of you very, very quickly, maybe 2 minutes. Incoming president is about to start his term. What tasks lie ahead for him? What should be on his table when he gets in?
I think, literally picking up from what Abiba said, beyond the crisis of legitimacy, quote unquote, is a man who's been declared president who ran on a very ethnic campaign. Is that what the word is? So his initial statement was Emilokan, which means it's, before then he said Yoruba Lokan, so an ethnic group, and then said within the Yoruba Emilokan, it's my turn. Now, having said that, you then have an election in his home state, quote unquote, where non-Yoruba, Southwest Nigeria, were literally told that they don't belong in that state, and he has said nothing. So I think in addition to the crisis of legitimacy that he's dealing with, is also posturing that he's the president of Nigeria. And he hasn't done that. And I think for me that's significant because you've been declared president, you've had a few weeks post that. One of your aides, actually, one of his media aides was also saying very ethnically inciting comments. He still has a job. So the signaling from your campaign to post-campaign is one that is literally, I really don't care. And so if you add that to the crisis of legitimacy, it's a lot. So if he's really serious about bringing Nigerians together, I think that's one thing that's certainly on his plate. And secondly, for him, and I guess also for civil society at large, we certainly need to do what Kenya and Ghana does. All election tribunal issues must be sorted before anybody gets sworn in. It just helps us a lot. Because that's taken, for example, right now, a lot of bandwidth with people saying the elections were contested, blah, 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 he shouldn't be sworn in. But our laws don't support that.
Habiba, during the elections, I barely heard any talk of the climate. I remember at a point, though, Bola Tinubu was asked something about climate, and he said something along the lines of, if the West would want us to act and do blah, 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 they should basically empower us. So it almost seems as if it's a they problem alone and not an us problem as well. What's your take?
No, there is an equity issue with climate change, right? We aren't responsible for the emissions, so we need the support to be able to drive them down. But beyond that, I think it's foolish to expect international powers to suddenly give you a blank check to be able to address climate change within your country, especially when climate change has the power to reverse any developmental progress that you have made, as we saw with the flooding. So personally, I feel I can say bluntly, I don't think they have a plan for climate. They have an energy transition plan in place that I think is not realistic. And I think the evidence for that is that we've asked McKinsey to release the plan repeatedly and they've refused, because we need to focus on an actionable, realistic strategy for the energy sector. So far, thinking about the energy transition, we're working in a new paradigm where we actually have investment drying up because the G7 or the global north wants to support green infrastructure and green energy. However, we do not have that industrial base to be able to be supported. And they are saying they want to do fossil fuel bans and things like that. So we have drying up investment. We have a liquidity crisis with the distribution and generation companies in the sector. At the same time, we have actually the impacts of climate change that we need to address. So for me, it's that without coming up with a team that can deal with these issues, so they're all surrounding energy access and energy availability within the country, without doing that, I do not see the hope for improving investment or economic development, because without energy, nobody's coming to Nigeria to buy a 1 megawatt diesel generator to power a factory. You want the enabling infrastructure to be in place. So I would say that should be where he starts. I think the second thing is the models of electrification that we've been embarking on during the Buhari administration have been largely donor funded. And what we've ended up is, particularly with rural electrification and a bit with the transmission companies as well, you just have a subsidy reliant sector that can never compete if those donors decide to pull out the dollars. So we do really need to have a conversation about viable models of electrification, whether the state is going to lead rural electrification and focus private investment on on-grid sector, but it needs to be a conversation. Maybe the last thing I'll say is now the powers with the amendment to the Electricity Act, we now have subnational governments have the power to generate, distribute, and transmit their own electricity. There are a few states that are not insolvent. It would be really interesting to see what a model of a subnationally driven electrification would look like, because if the federal government is sort of debt-ridden, we do need to consider alternative models.
Yeah. Cheta, security is a massive one, isn't it?
Yes, but I'll disagree with Habiba on climate. Yeah. I don't think climate should be the first priority. Mm-hmm. What I think should be the first priority is what feeds into security, insecurity, jobs. So you have a situation where officially, and the last count was in the third quarter of 2020, we have an official unemployment rate of 33%. 33% in Nigerian terms means that every morning the combined populations of Belgium, Tunisia, and Croatia wake up and don't have anything to do. That's a problem. When you have that many people who have nothing to do, they're going to cut down all the trees in order to eat. You can't tell them about climate. And that is why Nigeria's insecurity has been growing. It's one of the reasons. But, and this is one thing that bothers me, during the run-up to the elections, the insecurity in the country kind of like mellowed a bit before picking up after the elections. It tells me that there's latent state capacity somewhere to bring things back to order. Why is it not being utilized? Why is the Nigerian establishment sitting back and letting the country fall to pieces? These are questions that we need to ask. These are very uncomfortable questions. But piggybacking on what Yemi said about the president-elect's, the manner of campaign that he ran, it's going to be rather difficult to bring people together because there's already mistrust that has been built. How do we overcome that? At the very least, the media aides who made very incendiary statements about some ethnic groups should have been fired, and very publicly. That would have been the first step towards building some confidence that this will be a president for all. And the moment you have a president who is seen as not being a president for all, you have people pulling in different directions, which will essentially make insecurity even worse. But at the end of the day, we still have to come back to jobs. I believe that Nigeria's insecurity problem is distinctly economic in nature. It's because we have a very high population of people who do not have anything to do, and so because of that, extremist criminal gangs and all these assorted variety of people become very attractive to them. That is where we have to start.
We will touch on all these things again, but Yemi, I'll come to you. We've talked about the election that just happened. We saw the wave, particularly from the Peter Obi camp, of young people and how they were engaged. But I mean, Nigeria is not only made up of young people. There's other people as well of all ages. How is this engagement, this civic engagement, coming along? We've seen one example of it in the Peter Obi camp, but overall, what have you seen, and what models do you think can be built upon for Nigeria going forward in terms of civic engagement, in terms of just building this democracy of Nigeria?
I mean, so I think unfortunately for many years, civic engagement in a sense has been outsourced to civil society organizations, so sort of formal structures. But probably as more awareness has been raised around how governance is structured, the role of citizens, the power that citizens have, it has shifted a bit. And so for Peter Obi, I think what's instructive, for example, from the Peter Obi movement is that it wasn't about Peter. So Peter kind of became the focal point of a movement that decided they wanted something different. And I think that also speaks to when people, so let me pivot it a little bit. So to start with NSAS, October 2020, young people started protesting against police brutality. Again, not in any necessarily organized manner, but there was a singularity of purpose in that sense. But what then happened was that because it wasn't crystallized into form, it became kind of amorphous over the next 2-3 years. As elections came up, that energy for not everybody, but for quite a number of people, then needed yet again a singular issue. And the singular issue became that we were anti-establishment and Peter Obi is our anointed one, quote unquote. Now, moving forward, what has failed, in my opinion, is the fact that that hasn't been anchored fully in what we like to call the office of the citizen. But that, again, is where I think, to maybe Cheta's point, some hope around what that could be. Now, citizens understanding that they have power are seeing that in what they were able to do with the Obi movement. But secondly, also in not just at the presidential level, but at local elections. So at some gubernatorial elections, at some National Assembly elections, you saw citizens mobilizing around individuals because of what that individual represented. Institutionally, what we have seen, for example, I would say with civil society, interestingly, is with the election management body, INEC. Over the last 4 elections, INEC has improved significantly in terms of its output. And I say that when people are saying, but because organizations, in a sense, have kept them under the spotlight. So constantly checking, constantly asking questions. So by no means perfect, but a far cry from what they used to be, again, in citizens saying that you are there as a government institution, but you're there to serve us, and we will hold you accountable to that. So I think with some mixed bag of success, half-missed opportunities, but I think at the heart of it really is citizens getting to the point that they understand that they have power and engaging from that perspective.
In engaging the citizen, maybe I could bring Habiba in. We're talking about the climate and the fact that the leaders, the people who are campaigning, who are getting into power, are not putting the climate anywhere near their top priorities. Yet we see the worst flood in however long, affecting millions upon millions of people. How do you get those people to understand and engage that this issue is part of this civic engagement we're talking about, that this is not some issue that belongs to people in the offices somewhere in the West.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of public sensitization that needs to happen around climate change, unless it translates into impacts. The reality is that the average sub-Saharan African probably doesn't care about climate just because of some of these development challenges like poverty that rank above. But when you see the potential of extreme weather events to actually disrupt your livelihood, then we stir the conversation around, okay, this should be a priority. I don't advocate that climate change should be, I talk of climate change and energy being interlinked because I think we can't separate the two now. It's not that it's the most crucial thing, it's that it has the power to actually disrupt every other sector. And that is why it's important, that's why it needs to be discussed. We have to sensitize the public within the context of impacts, and I think there's a lot of poor reporting on climate change. I feel like every time it's really hot in Yola or Maiduguri, somebody's like, climate change, and I'm like, it's always been hot in Maiduguri. But we need, from the media perspective, a better understanding of how the longer term trends and how climate change is impacting them and translating what that means for industries and local livelihoods. And that's not just, okay, it's going to disrupt your physical environment, but also understanding that the decisions that the nations of the world are taking because of climate change, how they're adapting their economic policy or whatever, is going to impact Nigeria's ability to compete as an economy. I think that is something we need to discuss more. And language plays a big role. I think somebody asked me what climate change was in Hausa like some months back, and I have no idea. But even the language to make it accessible to the average citizen who may not have this discourse in English is very, very important. And I think the media and civil society organizations are probably best placed to do that, as academics and researchers tend to focus on our reports.
Just to bridge from that, Nigeria has this green energy transition, whatever we think of it. How can Germany, how can the EU engage with Nigeria and support Nigeria to have a plan that is realistic and that is effective as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a country like Germany that has a leadership position within the EU and within the G7, probably the first thing I would say in terms of adapting their perspective about delivering sort of decarbonization efforts within the continent. I think right now, when we're thinking within the context of an industrialized economy that has an established industrial base, stable energy demand, transition means something very different. If they make decisions on their energy policy or to build certain green infrastructure that fails, they have legacy infrastructure to fall back on. We don't have that in Nigeria, and I think we are trying to leapfrog, but really we don't have a proven model of leapfrogging in this new sort of low-carbon paradigm. So I think when those bodies are making decisions about restricting investment in certain types of energy technologies, they have to understand the negative impacts on poorer countries that do not have any alternatives should that bet on solar or wind or whatever technology fail. So I think there needs to be a perspective shift, first and foremost, amongst Western countries or the global superpowers, and I think Germany can do that. Germany is one of the voices that leads on the fossil fuel bans with no kind of exceptions, even though it clearly has a business case in some countries, whether that's Nigeria or Mozambique. So I think that's something that needs to change. The second is in terms of the types of partnerships that we develop. Of course, Germany has a lot of interest in green hydrogen, in the vehicles manufacturing. But you cannot present the partnership as, oh, we can outsource production, but every other value addition then happens in Germany. If we're going to produce green hydrogen in Nigeria or elsewhere, we should be able to utilize some of that green hydrogen. So those partnerships should be structured to enable some local value addition. Export is great for the country. I mean, we do that with oil. If we have another fuel that we can export and compete in a low-carbon economy, that would be great. But I think a lot of the partnerships now are very German or EU-centric, where everybody's kind of producing to enable the economy of the EU, for example. So it would be great to see some of those partnerships focus more on local value addition. And just to make a general point about how we think about climate change, when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, reducing emissions is just one of 17. We prioritize job creation, innovation, and all those things. Emissions reductions cannot be an end. We have to think about it within the context of other development levers that we need to hit. So whereas it is perhaps because they're in a better economic state, it's easy for a country like Germany to just say we need to cut down emissions. They need to understand the price of cutting down emissions somewhere like Nigeria that still has all of these issues to address. So as they now strategize, whether it's with their green hydrogen plan or within the context of the EU Green Deal industrial plan, there needs to be, as they design their policies, need to understand that you cannot translate the same thing in the EU to Nigeria. And maybe the final point I'll make is in terms of concessional finance. We know what the interest rates are. I think I was discussing large-scale infrastructure projects going to the capital markets now. Double-digit interest rates are just not sustainable. But if you have some bilateral partnerships, we have the Presidential Power Initiative in place, that a state can provide single-digit interest rates to enable large-scale infrastructure projects, then a country like Germany is well-placed, because it's also a win-win, because a lot of the companies and contractors are likely going to be German. Continuing that and continuing that leadership on the international stage. We talk about climate finance, whether it's $100 billion or $750 billion, whatever you think is the fair number of what rich countries should provide to poor countries, we can agree that they're not doing enough. And the reality is that they do not have the interests of a country like Nigeria. I mean, they're still focused on their national interests, which is entirely fair. But if we want to be equitable, then I think they also need to ramp up some of their contributions for climate adaptation in particular, which probably is not revenue generating, unlike solar or wind. If we want to adapt to effects of climate change that we have no hope of reversing, then we do need this kind of concessional grant support to be able to deliver those interventions in Nigeria.
All right. And going along the lines of collaboration and effective collaboration, looking at security, Cheta, if I look at other West African countries, for example, Guinea, where they've had a coup recently, same with Mali, same with Burkina Faso, a lot of the people who have actually carried out these coups are well trained, received Western training. And sometimes people say Nigeria's security forces, it's about training, and that. Clearly, training is not the only thing. How can we have a kind of collaboration, a cross-continental collaboration, where there is that training, but there's also some kind of accountability? How have they been able to build accountability on this side that we can maybe borrow from?
I think it comes down to one word: institutions. So institutions in this part of the world have strengthened over the centuries, whereas in our part of the world, institutions have not exactly strengthened. So accountability is something that's kind of far from too many people in our subconscious. I mean, let's start with the most basic thing. You started this conversation by pointing out that nobody really knows how many Nigerians there are. If we don't know how many people we have in our country, that's the most basic thing. We can't count. Accountability comes from that. And this translates across the entire swath of the Sahel. But I'll still, like a broken record, keep coming back to the economy and jobs. One of the ways to kneecap the burden insecurity problems is to help the economy to grow. We've had, from Western countries, a security-led focus in our part of the world for a very long time. This security-led focus has ended up creating a vicious cycle of recurring and escalating violence. It's not an accident that all of the people who have planned and executed coups in these countries that you mentioned, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, have all trained at one point or the other in various American institutions. It's not an accident that all of the people who led coups in Nigeria's history trained at either Aldershot or Sandhurst, all of them. So there's something about the way our security establishments in our part of the world relates with the citizens. And there's a difference between the way the security establishments in this part of the world relates with citizens. I think the missing thread is that accountability. We need to start working on those systems. But systems are built by people. And people are built by education. So that's where there's a gap. The quality of education that people receive as they move from one stage of their lives to the next and to the next. The moment you have that gap, accountability systems break down, and when accountability systems break down, people don't feel beholden to the people who ostensibly put them there. Going back to Nigeria's elections, we have a situation where it is about 4% of Nigeria's population that elected the incoming government. Will the incoming government feel beholden to 200 million people, or will it feel beholden to the 4% that elected it? Those are questions. Again, still on security, training. You talked about training, the quality of training that our security agencies receive, and the ability for them to know where to stop. Probably what could have shaken Nigeria most fundamentally in recent years were the NSAS protests from 3 years ago. What triggered the NSAS protests? Nigerian policemen, a video of them beating up and killing someone and then taking his car. Naked theft by the very police who are meant to protect citizens. How did the NSAS protest end? Nigerian security forces shooting into a crowd of unarmed young Nigerians who were simply demanding an end to police brutality. Has anybody been brought to account for any of these crimes? The answer is no. So we don't have accountability. When you don't have accountability, when people lose faith in the system, which is the direct result of lack of accountability, what happens? They take the laws into their hands. And then over time, it all piles up. The law loses legitimacy in the eyes of the people. And people begin to resort to either taking the laws into their hands or alternative means of dispute resolution because they don't have the wherewithal to take the laws into their hands. So it's an entire vicious cycle that keeps reinforcing itself. We have to find something to break that vicious cycle. And I think that it starts from accountability, bringing people to justice publicly when they commit offenses.
Before we continue, before I ask my next question, I'll just highlight to everyone who's watching on our stream, hopefully we will have a point where we can get questions from you, and if you could email them, I think I've lost it. Oh, here we go. If you could email them, I don't know if the address is popping up on your screen, but it's events@opensocietyfoundations.org. Submit your questions to events@opensocietyfoundations.org, and then, time permitting, we will address your questions. But we've just been talking about accountability. This goes across the board, and one related issue, accountability, is corruption. Corruption is deep-seated in Nigeria, but the sense I'm getting is that corruption is, as deep-seated as it is, it's a result, it's a fruit of something rather than an actual seed in itself. Yemi, a lot can be said about corruption in Nigeria, but we have to move somewhere. We have to go forward somewhere. So how can Nigeria go forward? How can Nigeria be supported with its international partners to go forward, to build and somehow rid itself, or at least lessen the hold corruption has on all its systems, from democracy to wherever?
A friend of mine describes corruption so it's a synonym for decay. So when something is spoiled, and the way he says it, when a system is not working the way it's supposed to, it's spoiled, it's decayed, in the sense you can say it's corrupt. And so the fact that we see systemic corruption in Nigeria is because a lot of our institutions and individuals are not functioning as they should. Now, what then makes that sort of scale is because, as Cheta alluded to, there are no consequences. So impunity, there's no consequence management, and if it's okay to do what is wrong, I mean, we're all human. Humans, I mean, there's a Bible phrase that says the heart of man is desperately wicked. So there's no human that's born and is perfect. We all live in institutions that shape the way we behave because there are laws, and there are consequences for breaking those laws. So in Nigeria, we talk a lot about when people arrive in the West, they obey laws, because if you don't obey the law, you end up in jail or or fined or whatever the case may be. Now, and I tie that maybe slightly a bit to elections, to why the BBC's comment about the River State's results is also gaining a bit of traction, because a few days ago, the Secretary of State of the US has said they've imposed visa sanctions on Nigerians who compromised the elections. We don't know the names yet, but suddenly again, it's back sort of in people's minds that there were consequences. And so, tying back to what Jetta had said about NSAS, repeatedly you see things happen and nothing happens. The state, in a sense, does not respond. So and I think there's a lot of pressure placed on citizens that, oh, if everybody in their own space does the right thing, then there's a cumulative effect, and then there'll be kumbaya. I say that it's really literally the state that only has the capacity to scale in a way that there are consequences. So the opportunity, I would say, for Nigeria's bilateral or development partners is how are these things tied into monies or support that we are given. So the US has done it with visa sanctions because they were very clear that if you compromise the elections, there would be a consequence. The World Bank is giving us $800 million that there's some rumor that they've already released, which technically doesn't make any sense. This administration is exiting. Yes, you want to give Nigeria, the country, $800 million, but why would you do it in the dying days of an administration? Doesn't make sense to me. There's always this conversation around Nigerian politicians who come to places like Germany and France and the UK to get medical care. Now, they might be paying and not be, in a sense, taking advantage of the state, but what types of conversations are we having around from assets? I mean, we're doing much better with assets, like tracking assets or assets, beneficial ownership of assets. And that, again, our declared president, a recent one was tied to him. So I think some of these things constantly ensuring that when these conversations are happening, what is the demand that is placed on the table? And how are development partners or bilateral relationships not only doing something, but making it public? Because ultimately what Nigerians respond to is seeing that someone got punished for something. There's a whole conversation around NSAS and the military, and I can never, thank you very much, that word. What that could be done and what that looks like for the cases that are in court. So I think ultimately is using existing instruments to bring people to account, even if they won't be are not accountable in Nigeria.
Right, Habiba, let me come to you. Just talking about this sort of again, we've talked a lot about what Nigeria can get from in terms of support. What does Nigeria have to offer? You did mention that, for example, German company, when this kind of collaboration, you could have the German companies being able to have their input on the ground. What else can Nigeria offer in terms of the green, working in the green transition with offer to the world, offer to Germany, offer to the EU?
Yeah, I think we spoke about green hydrogen and generally more from a fuels production perspective. I think another aspect of the energy transition that we've discussed is just how minerals intensive it's going to be. Remaking an entire energy system will require a whole new suite. Maybe we've come from the oil, gas, and coal world, and now we're talking about cobalt, lithium, nickel, magnesium, enabling sectors like electric vehicles that places like Germany have a huge interest in. So, of course, we know that Southern Africa is very well mapped in terms of some of its geological and mineral resources, but West Africa is actually really poorly mapped, which means we've always thought of it as Nigeria is maybe not the zone to have lithium or any other mineral to be able to support the industry elsewhere. But as we've seen with maybe Tesla's interest and some little findings within the country, that there are some mineral deposits. I think with the right kind of support, whether it's grant support for geological surveys that need to be conducted across the country, we do get a better sense of what more we can offer beyond our traditional role of exporting fuels to enable other economies. I think shifting to maybe more minerals extraction is a possibility. Even better if we can refine that locally and use it to do some kind of value addition or component production within the country. I think that would enable industries, the car industry in places like Germany, to be able to thrive. It's it's interesting, the kind of support that we've gotten from a lot of these countries, it's not at the scale that it can move the needle. We've seen the partnerships work. We have a saying in the last 10 years of the energy sector is nobody wants to hear the word pilot project anymore. Because whether it's GIZ or AFD, will be like, we're going to remake rural electrification in Nigeria, here's 5 million euros. Okay, it's not going to change the lives of 80 million people. But they have trialed business models that work. Where we seem to fail is when it's, okay, we've done 10 sites, we want to do 10,000. How do we come up with the right financing structure or package to be able to support the delivery of such a large project? There isn't the appetite for large-scale projects from most of the global north, right? I know this is maybe changing as there's this EU-China, US-China standoff as they're trying to reclaim some of that infrastructure financing role from the Chinese. But we haven't seen the appetite from these bilateral partners to be actually invest at the scale to move the needle, even when the right ideas are there. So we definitely cannot, in terms of what we can offer, apart from enabling some of the industries that they have, I think in a very effective partnership, Nigeria is probably the best lab you can use to try and figure out. Apologies for calling it that, but it's a good lab for trying to figure out what it's gonna work for the rest of the continent, because we actually have a lot of, Nigeria doesn't get credit for a lot of things, but in terms of the renewable energy space, we probably have the best mini-grid, off-grid electrification regulatory environment in the continent, and which is why a lot of donor financing, but there's not much we can do with a very limited scale. So we do have a lot to offer in terms of being a model for the kind of change that they need to see across the rest of the continent, but we do need the support.
Yeah. Well done. Cheta, there's speaking of what Nigeria can offer, Nigeria's what's the word? Unintentionally giving the world its people through the Jagba, as they call it, phenomenon, which is the wave of Nigerians who are not just any Nigerian, but a lot of Nigeria's highest skilled people are leaving the country in droves, coming this way. And how can Nigeria? What else can Nigeria give beyond these kinds of push factors? What actual structured schemes can Nigeria offer to the world beyond kicking its people out, in a sense?
Well, let's start with gas. In the sector that Habiba plays in, Nigeria is usually defined as an island of petrol sitting in a sea of gas. We have 3% of the world's gas reserves, something of the sort. I think 187 trillion cubic feet of gas in reserve. And a lot of it is flared off. Germany, for example, has a problem that the failure of Ostpolitik, where Putin is now trying to use gas as a weapon against Germany. The German Chancellor visited some African countries. He started with Senegal, and crucially, he skipped Nigeria. That was an unbelievable miss, because we have, 20 times the gas capacity of Senegal? So that is something that we could give, and that's something that we don't have to refine in Nigeria. Probably just liquefy it and ship it across. And so that is one opportunity. But the people that Nigeria is exporting is also an opportunity. Again, coming to Germany, because I'm beating Germany to a stick because we happen to be sitting in Germany. Germany is looking for people. The West is looking for people. Birth rates are falling. And Nigeria has a population of skilled people who, like I talked about earlier, don't have jobs. According to a study that SBM Intelligence conducted in 2020, last year, in 2021, Nigerian students handed over about £2 billion to the British Treasury, in billion, 2 with a big B, billion. in terms of moving from Nigeria to the UK. Germany didn't take advantage of that. So you have to ask why. And the answer is staring us in the face. It's much more difficult to get a German visa. Yep. You get hostile treatments. Yesterday I was practically detained at the border in the airports because I said, "Why are you coming?" And it was hostile. And I know it's because I have a Russian visa and my passport, but the nature of my work means that I have been to Russia some years ago. So when you have that kind of hostility, you miss opportunities. Now, another thing is...
Fine. There's some of these things where Nigeria can offer, but how can these offerings be mutually beneficial? So it's not just Nigeria giving and not gaining.
One thing that is not talked about over the last 10 years is that remittances has actually superseded oil as the biggest revenue generator for Nigeria. So essentially, let me take one sector that has been particularly badly hit in Nigeria, the medical sector. We have, 76,000 registered doctors in Nigeria, but every single state in Nigeria has a deficit of doctors. The recommended UN ratio, if I remember correctly, is one doctor to 600 people. Nigeria's actual ratio is 1 doctor to 5,500 people, almost 10 times deficit. These doctors move because logically, a doctor who is earning 250,000 naira per month in Nigeria, a rough guide, it's not very accurate, a rough guide would be 25 euro, moves to the West, and his salary is immediately improved by a factor sometimes of 100. But he still has family back home who he sends money to and then involuntarily uplifts them. Now, nobody seems to have... Now, nobody seems to have thought of a program or something because, and for the record, all of my siblings are doctors, and my father's only bad child. I refused to study medicine. All of them are doctors, and all of them are practicing in the United States. And I was discussing something with them. Why not set up, even if you don't build a hospital, set up a hospital where at least those of you who are outside the country can come on a rotational basis home to give your time to help with the medical shortage that we're beginning to see. So these are ways. First instance, we need money. Our economy is not generating enough jobs, has never generated enough jobs for the graduates that our universities churn out. So people need to move. It's going to happen. We need to be realistic about that. But the question is, when these people move, how do we give back? And it starts with remittances and then offering time and services. So that way, it is also beneficial to Nigeria. But Western countries should also realize that the Nigerians are coming. It can't be stopped. So to prevent that from becoming also something inimical to Western interests, Western countries also have to choose their friends in Africa more carefully. Because in all honesty, Hemediti, who is causing a lot of havoc in Sudan, was sponsored by the EU for a brief period. For what reason? To keep migrants out. A lot of the warlords in Libya were sponsored by the EU at a start. So some of these things are part of what that vicious cycle I talked about. We keep enabling the worst kind of people because we are looking at short-term solutions to what really are long-term problems.
And just to really add to that quickly, also not be mindful of a lot of the immigration is fueled by the West in terms of deliberately looking for high-skilled employees from the UK to the US to parts of the EU as well. So,
well, the UK did Brexit, so because of that, they need people now very desperately.
Yeah, I wanted to make that point because you mentioned that the people leaving because they don't have jobs. What I find is that the people leaving have jobs in Nigeria. They just want to get paid more.
Exactly.
And because they're skills, because you can't move to the UK or Germany without the work experience, right, to prove on your CV. Yeah. And I think this is where I do not see it so much as a mutually beneficial, because the nation building effort required and the people who are going to create the businesses that are going to create jobs for lower skilled are elsewhere. So I do sympathize with the idea of, yes, coming on a rotational basis, but we do need people full-time committed to building businesses in Nigeria.
But the business environment is very tough.
Yeah.
So we have something called the Land Use Act. Let's start with that. That's probably one of the biggest barriers to doing business. So one thing that the Nigerian government at an institutional level needs to do is to learn how to get out of the way of business. It's that simple.
Thank you very much. I will just turn now away from the panel and to one of our distinguished guests, Alexander Calegaro, who will give us a bit of a response. He is the deputy head of the Division for West and Central Africa from the German Foreign Office.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you very much for this very interesting debate. Something that I'm always impressed when I'm in Nigeria, visit Nigeria, or follow Nigerian discussions is the diversity and of civil society and how committed they are to the advocacy and the themes and the causes, and how broad the range of opinions is. And this is something that we really appreciate. Germany and Nigeria have very long-standing relationships and a very broad range of cooperation. I was, to be honest, expecting a bit more to hear about Nigeria's role in a changing world, which was the subject of the discussion today. This seems to be a very domestic debate that happened here today, and of course, as a representative of the German Foreign Office, I'm not the best suited person to comment on Nigerian domestic politics. But so I wanted to offer this more international perspective, if I may, and just to highlight at the beginning that our Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, visited Nigeria as one of her first trips to Africa during her first year of tenure, and it was the largest delegation that she ever had with. The Nigerian ambassador to Germany was there as well. He can witness to it. I was also honored to be part of the delegation, and this shows the importance that Nigeria has for Germany. It has been mentioned here in this event that Nigeria is the most populous country, the strongest economy, the geostrategic importance at the crossroads between the Sahel, the Gulf of Guinea, and Central Africa has been mentioned. It hasn't been mentioned that Nigeria is the most important member state of ECOWAS. Nigeria is also a very important member state of the African Union. And Nigeria is very active in the international community. Nigeria and Germany share the interest to protect the rule-based international order. Germany believes that Africa should be given the voice it merits based on its geopolitical importance. So Germany supports, for instance, a stronger representation of African countries within the United Nations Security Council. And when we talk about more African leadership, African solutions, or African-led initiatives for regional, global challenges, and I think we all agree we live in a world with complex, global, interrelated challenges. Then we need, of course, countries in Africa that are able and willing to take a leadership within the African Union, within ECOWAS, within the regions, and I think this is why Germany looks to Nigeria, because Nigeria has proven in the past that it is able and willing to take this leadership, and it does make a difference within ECOWAS. And we talked here a lot about the elections. Also the countries in West Africa that have experienced coups have been mentioned. Some of them, the coups followed some constitutional crisis where presidents tried to go for a third mandate. And this is something that the Nigerian government has always been very clear about, both within Nigeria and within West Africa, by condemning all attempts for unconstitutional changes of power and by excluding from the very beginning the possibility of a third term. So I would say we do share many international values that are based on documents from the United Nations, African Union, European Union, ECOWAS. So we have a strong interest in working together. And we're very keen to engage with the new government to work on all of these challenges. The question was asked here a few times, what can Nigeria offer to Germany? And there were a few concrete proposals, raw materials, gas, labor force. But I think really what we want is strong international leadership on those global challenges of today and the future, a strong cooperation on that, and to be able to play this role, of course, we need the country to be strong, the government to be strong and have legitimacy. So our cooperation also focuses on those areas, on those needs, on those interests that we hear from our Nigerian partners. We talked a lot about today. Talk a lot today about the energy transition plan, and here again, of course, we all agree Africa doesn't have a historic share in the responsibility for carbon emissions, but today Nigeria is one of the largest emitters in Africa, and it would be a huge symbolic achievement if Nigeria became one of the largest proponents of supporters of energy transition, both domestically and globally. So I think we're looking, and especially this government in Germany is very keen in forging a just coalition against climate change. And there's something where we can work together on an international level, on a bilateral level. We are very keen to support the ambitious energy transition plan. So we want also, we are already speaking to the current Nigerian administration, and we're very keen to continue cooperating with the future incoming Nigerian government on that. I think there are many levels where we can work together. We can work together on providing technical expertise to design a roadmap for the concrete implementation of the energy transition plan, to make it, to make the implementation concrete. Energy access has been mentioned. I could also add energy efficiency. There are many ways of reducing emissions. That doesn't mean giving up existing infrastructure, but making it better, make it advanced, make it more accessible. And of course, emissions reductions is also a bit part of it, increasing the share of renewable energies, working together on green hydrogen. And as a matter of fact, there is a German-Nigerian energy partnership in place since 2008. And 1.5 years ago, within this energy partnership, we opened a Nigerian-German hydrogen office in Abuja. where there are lots of events, trainings, exchange events for German in Nigeria, private actors, economic actors. So I think there are many opportunities for cooperation. Just to come back to the visit of Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock to Nigeria in December, she talked with her counterpart, Foreign Minister Oniyama, about the binational commission, which is a cooperation format between Germany and Nigeria that has been in place for 12 years now, where we have regular meetings at different levels, including the highest levels, and both foreign ministers agreed that we want to build on this existing partnership, make it more modern, more strategic, more active. So this is something that we look forward to do with the next incoming government. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. On that note, we have seen, I think it's fair to say over the past few years, particularly under this outgoing administration, Nigeria taking a rather subdued role on the international scene, be it just visibility, be it being in its expressiveness, be it in being an example in a wide range of issues. And for example, we look at all the troubles we mentioned in West Africa. Normally, Nigeria is the one who goes forward and looks to mediate, looks to sort things out. I remember even as recently as Gambia, when they had the Yahya Jammeh misbehaving, and Nigeria was right there. One would expect that with Ethiopia's conflict, with Sudan going on at the moment, Nigeria would be there, but it seems to have taken a back seat. And that brings me to one of the questions that has come in online. On geopolitics, it says on geopolitics, or rather, sorry, this is just, well, one of the other questions, but EU foreign ministers recently announced an action plan on the geopolitical consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and identified Nigeria as a country of focus. So and that's the only country in Africa mentioned in this. So how do you see the recent geopolitical developments impacting EU-Nigeria relations? I think let's keep in mind what's happening with South Africa and Russia. Nigeria's not been very vocal. So where does Nigeria, what are the opportunities here that for Nigeria to assert itself and show something?
I think it's important to point out that Nigeria, in all the UN resolutions, voted against the Russian aggression in Ukraine. It's important to point that out. So when we say Nigeria has not been very vocal, that's technically not accurate. We have at least used our votes to say this is wrong. However, it's difficult for Nigeria to take a front seat when we have so many internal crises that we have to sort. It's just that simple. We have a capacity issue. Look at, for example, the evacuation from Sudan was bungled, and it was only by the grace of God, to use a Nigerianism, that those students got back home in one piece. So over the last 8 years, yes, Nigeria has withdrawn from the international stage in many respects, and I would place the first blame on diminishing Nigerian capacity. But secondly, in international geopolitics, there are realities that we have to accept. There are two superpowers in West Africa, Nigeria and France. So Berlin has to talk to Paris to stop meddling. Because when Nigeria tries to, quote unquote, set its neighborhood aright, the French are always there, almost guaranteed with opposing interests. That is problematic. So that is a reality that we have to address head on. Then geopolitically, the uncomfortable truth is that for a very long time, the relationship between the West and Africa has not exactly been a relationship of equals. And even the West doesn't see it that way in terms of their behavior, not in terms of the rhetoric. So the Chinese, the Turks, who nominally are part of NATO, but are the guys in the room that are not exactly friendly with everybody else. The Chinese, the Turks, and even the Russians are giving something that especially authoritarian-leaning African leaders want in exchange. So these are uncomfortable conversations that need to be had. What is our interest? You want to win the people of Nigeria and other African countries to your side, because ultimately power resides with the people, no matter where. You want to win them to your side, then help with the things that really matter to the people. And from where I'm standing, again, I'm sounding like a broken record, it's the economy. Once we can start fixing the economies of these countries, however way we do it, you will see a different conversation. One of the reasons why the Chinese have been successful, despite the fact that they've never had an age of enlightenment, they don't come with things that would help keep stability in these countries long term. But they come with the immediate short-term needs. They bridge infrastructural gaps. So the West actually needs to start bridging these infrastructural gaps very quickly. We have a history, not the most comfortable of histories, but there's a history there nevertheless. So when the Chinese are coming with $1.5 billion for a single country, and then the Americans are telling us, oh, we'll give you $55 billion for the entire continent, and at the same time, without questions asked, giving $300 billion to Ukraine. A lot of people in Africa look at it and say, oh, maybe we should listen to those Chinese then. These are uncomfortable truths that need to be said.
In fact, just as recently as yesterday, I heard the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz speaking at the Global Solutions Summit, and he was acknowledging a lot of these things. And I think there is the light bulb is going off here. That there are these inconsistencies. There's the double standards essentially. Yeah. Sorry, Habiba.
Just to come in quickly on this Russia-Ukraine, how it influences EU-Nigeria relations. I just wanted to highlight from an equity perspective, prior to that conflict, there was very much from COP26 in Glasgow, the UN Climate Change Conference, most of the EU countries and the US were leaning towards a ban on public finance for fossil fuels overseas. Despite the pleas of whether it's the Vice President Yemi Osinbajo saying, do you know what, it's still strategic for Nigeria and for several countries. But they were going to press ahead despite the pleas of African leaders about what's best. And then suddenly you have some gas becoming a political tool, and perhaps they need to diversify the supply. And then we have John Kerry, we have representatives from the EU saying, okay, maybe some natural gas is actually needed in Africa. Conveniently, when we're needing to shore up some of our supplies. The representative from the German Foreign Office mentioned Nigeria's partnership in tackling global challenges like climate change. You only want to tackle a global challenge if you can genuinely see the opportunity. And so far, addressing those global challenges is within the context of creating opportunities in the global north. And I think that's why it hasn't created so much traction. If I can put a roadmap in front of you and say, look, if you scale solar in Nigeria, this is your job creation impact. We have the financing available. This is how you can move your economy forward. But that's not where it's been. That's not where we've seen the focus. It's really support us in this challenge, even though the picture is a bit uncertain about what it means for you. And when it comes to the world of, let's say, renewable energy in particular, what a lot of people don't realize is renewable energy is not that cheap in Nigeria. I was talking to a big bank a few days ago, and they were like, yeah, we fund these projects at 30% interest rate. Or the PPAs that were agreed in 2014 that have still not been realized were at 11 cents per kilowatt hour. I think we forget that the local factors that make solar cheap have not been realized because of the challenging business environment.
Let me give you an example. I have solar panels on my roof in Lagos. They cost me over ₦1 million. Median income in Nigeria is 137,600 naira. So how many Nigerians can afford it?
financing that makes sense.
Which doesn't exist.
Exactly. And so it's if you make the right support available for this industry to thrive, then it is possible. But there's also the double standard that we need to address, that you're still not thinking about this challenge from the perspective of what's in it for us, what's in it for Nigeria. Okay, if we tell them to do this green hydrogen or solar, what can we create there? And also what value can we export for ourselves? I think that is something that a lot of leaders have shied away from, being like, okay, maybe they're just not interested in climate change, they don't see the value. But really, it's not been presented as a value-creating opportunity, whereas across maybe the UK that I'm more familiar with, and a lot of green policies started to gain traction when people saw the value it could bring in terms of creating industry and in terms of not just decarbonization. You had to put a monetary value on what it does. So we need that that being afforded to us as well. That perspective needs to be translated to places like Nigeria, and then discussion of some of this large-scale infrastructure support that we don't tend to see from the global north anymore, or for a while.
Just throwing in another question that we've probably not talked about, Abiba, you have written on this. Relating to agriculture, agriculture is one of the biggest employers in Nigeria, but it's not scaling in the way it should. And Nigeria can be a model for other African countries who have very similar demographics, very similar job structures in terms of people depending on agriculture. How can this be elevated? What's the way forward?
So agriculture is an important sector, not just because of job creation, right, and the food production that comes of it that may have export value. But one thing I've found is that we do talk about Nigeria as this agricultural powerhouse, but in reality, I don't feel like it is. I've been working in agriculture for the last 2 years now, actually in rural communities trying to build mini-grid solar-powered agricultural processing centers in Nigeria. And I work mostly across rice and oil palm has been the focus across both the north and south of the country. When you see the yields that are coming from, it's 2 tons per hectare. And then you hear that in Australia they do 10 tons per hectare. It's not productive agriculture because they've been practicing agriculture in a subsistence fashion where there hasn't been any mechanization, but there's also the land quality is poor because the land has been overused. There's just a massive education gap, and maybe that links to your point about education at different levels or stages of life when you want to pursue a particular vocation. The second thing is in terms of after you have that harvest, all the road infrastructure to get my rice paddy to the nearest market that's 20 kilometers away, it's not there. I don't have a silo that I can build because I'm poor. If I want to process it, I don't have the electricity to actually or I'm using equipment. Just as an interesting tidbit, in the rice sector, we went into one of the communities and the engine had 1923 or something like that marked on it. An engine that's almost 100 years old, God knows where it came from, on a ship probably from the UK a century ago. But people are still using that to process rice with 60% of the grain being broken. You're not going to get value addition across the sector. Energy is one lever, but also the education and then the types of interventions. We've seen the state focus on, okay, if I just give this person a subsidy to buy fertilizer and seeds, then they're going to be able to sort of improve. But if you don't know how to farm, it doesn't matter if you have seeds because you actually don't know what to do with them. So I think there's a huge education gap. And then coming to the climate angle, people talk about decarbonization, we focus on energy, but Nigeria doesn't produce that much energy that its emissions are bothering. But we do have very poor land use practices and a high level of deforestation because people keep using bioenergy for cooking. So in terms of, as we are thinking about transforming the agricultural sector, that education, but also it's an opportunity to then put in climate-smart agriculture. How do we get people to then reform agricultural practices in a way that we can avoid the emissions that's coming from the land use, but also they can become more productive?
Right. I was going to come to you just to finish up because we're out of time, but go ahead, and I had one minute question for you, so make your last point and then.
No, I just wanted to tie a bit of what you were saying, because Alexandra spoke about Nigeria and a leadership role. You talked about sort of the geopolitics and people paying attention, or especially authoritarian leaders on the continent and really globally, paying attention to China, Russia, whatever. And it takes me back to elections and the understanding of democracy. So different countries practice democracies in different ways, and there are different manifestations there. And I think for Germany and the EU, given the significant amounts of money that comes into funding elections in Nigeria, there needs to be a lot more thought beyond funding elections as an event. Because if we continue to think of elections as we're pumping, so 1 year to an election, EU, everybody pumps in money so that we do voter registration, go and get ready, and everybody goes to vote, and after that we disappear. Until the money is used to getting people to understand what a democracy is and contextualize it between sort of cultural practices, then we continue to fund events, and you will not get the leadership you're looking for on the national scale because the outcomes will fall below ideal.
You actually answered the question I was going to ask you. So. Great. Thank you to our distinguished panel. It's been very insightful hearing from you. I will hand over to our what's the word? Our main host, our grand host, Olumide Abimbola, for some final remarks.
What Finn is going to say to you calling me the grand host, but happy to take it from you. Oh, thank you. But I found it really interesting that we had to go from Nigeria to Germany to get some nice words about Nigeria. That's what we do to each other all the time, and it's fantastic. It's great. I heard a lot here today. I heard that we don't know how many we are in Nigeria. I kind of knew that, but it's good to hear it again. I had security, I had job creation, I had migration, I had remittances, I had climate change. Yesterday I was in the room when the German Chancellor was talking about, that the fact that they're now having to listen because they haven't listened and they understand the inequities around some of these issues where suddenly money becomes available when it becomes pressing here, when it becomes pressing, when they feel it here. One thing that he said and I found really interesting was around migration. Someone, a Nigerian woman, young lady, asked a question about, 70% of Nigerians are young, and job creation is an issue. And he said something. So the German Chancellor said something that I found a point that I've been trying to make for a while. It was interesting to hear the German Chancellor make it, which is that it's not possible for any African government to create the jobs that young people need. Just the amount of young people we have on the continent. No country has ever done it in the history of humanity, and it's probably going to be done. And that the migration is going to have to be one of the solutions. We're going to have to discuss how to do it well. We're going to have to discuss how it doesn't become what is commonly called brain drain. We're going to have to discuss how we don't have one doctor per 5,500 people in Nigeria because doctors are leaving. There will have to be ways to manage it. Europe needs people, Germany needs skills. Some are easier to create than others. IT skills, a year, you have a good developer if you work hard. Doctors takes you 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So we're going to have to find a way to balance the needs across both sides. But there is no way that migration will not be part of the discussion. So I was really happy to hear yesterday. And I was thinking, he's reading me, and it's great. I hope he is. So I'm supposed to have an Oscar moment now where I give votes of thanks to everyone, including God and my parents. But I won't do my God and my parents, at least not right now. I want to first of all thank His Excellency Ambassador Tuga for honoring our invitation to be the guest of honor here today. And I want to thank him specifically for that very quick, short clap. Which was very random, but also it was well placed. So thank you so much, Ambassador, and thanks for your usual support to APRI. We're really glad to have you here. I want to thank the panel for an excellent job. I'm happy we got to do this and to do it the way we wanted to do it. Thank you so much for being here. To you, Yemi, to you, Habiba, and to you, Cheta. Fantastic to have you here. Thanks a lot to you, Tommy, for guiding us through the discussion today. Always great to have you guide. Thank you so much. I also want to thank Alex Caligaro from the Foreign Office. Very happy to hear that The administration is going to continue working with Nigerians looking for opportunities. We can find a way to discuss a bit around that later, but really happy to hear that. Thanks a lot. Last but not least, I want to thank my team at APRI and OSF, the teams, program teams, but also comms teams. I want to thank in APRI, Sewa, Nora, Paul, Hannah, and Ayobami. And also at OSF, I want to thank Finn, I want to thank Gertz, Bram, Ilaria, Thorsten, and Ilona for the excellent work. We are proud of the collaboration. It's great to be doing this together with you. And on behalf of APRI and OSF, I want to thank the audience, both in here and also online. And I was really happy that we could get that questioning thing to work online. We got a question from the online audience. For those in the room, the panelists are still here. There's something to eat over there. We can continue the conversation over there. Thank you so much.